My next guest is Dr. Lindsay Whorton. She is the president of the Holdsworth Center, a nonprofit dedicated to building stronger leaders for public schools. She is the author of A New School Leadership Architecture, which calls for a fundamental design of how leadership roles are structured and practiced in schools, offering a bold new blueprint to make jobs sustainable and give teachers the coaching and support they need so students thrive. She is also the author of Teachers, Unions, and Educational Reform in Comparative Context. Well, welcome to the podcast, Lindsay.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll start off with a question I ask everyone. Tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Yeah. So I know that for many of the listeners, there's a very specific trench that we're talking about. It's a very specific trench to work as I'm a classroom teacher for a career. And so I would want to start by saying I dreamed of that being my job in my career. So when I was in fifth grade, I decided that the best job you could have and the most important job and the hardest job you could have in the country would be to be a teacher. And I pursued that and was trained and did my student teaching. And then I kind of got put on a different path. And so I always think it's important to acknowledge that I don't come to this work. With that kind of traditional sustained career in the classroom. But I do come to this work with like enormous appreciation and respect and honor for that work, and kind of view my job and the job I have now, leading a nonprofit, other work that I've done in education, to try to be to create the conditions that allow teachers and students to thrive. So I think my trench. Now is being in a nonprofit in Texas, working to build leadership and strengthen public schools. And I think the thing I have in common, probably with a lot of the listeners, is that every day, I think if you're doing this right, you go home, and it doesn't quite feel like enough, because there's like always more that you could do for students and the people that you serve. And I think to me, like when I have one of those days where the gap between like what we're able to do and the needs of teachers, students, and leaders feels really big. I think I take encouragement from like one, being inspired by the incredible people doing this work alongside us, and two, by the fact that we get to go back tomorrow and take it on again. So I think that's my version of a trench, but I always want to acknowledge that my experience is a little bit different and try to play the role that I play with like great humility and respect for the people who are doing the most important work, which is working in our classrooms.
Well, thanks for acknowledging that. And, whether you're working in a nonprofit, consulting with schools, or in the school itself, working in education is a trench, no matter how you look at it. And really, trying to serve when there is that large amount of work to do to serve our students and our teachers. So we're here to talk about your latest book, which is Teachers, Unions, and Education Reform in Comparative Context. So talk to me a little bit about what got you started in writing this book, and then a little bit about your work around the architecture, uh, around teachers, unions, and educational
Yeah.
reform.
So if it's okay, the newest book is a new school leadership architecture. And so I'll talk about that one a bit, and then I can acknowledge the union work, and we can certainly dig into that a bit more. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So a new school leadership architecture came out in October, and probably a little bit of background. So the organization I lead, the Holdsworth Center, is focused on leadership, as you talked about in the intro. And when we started in 2017, we were really laser focused on how do we help schools and districts develop excellent principals. The person who created our organization leads a wonderful business in Texas called HEB. And he knows the research that says teachers are the very most important school level factor for student learning. And there's hundreds of thousands of teachers in Texas. And so was searching for something that might be a little bit more high leverage that could be done to support teachers and students. And so, the research points to principals as a big factor. in teachers' experience, their satisfaction of their job, whether they stay, whether they grow. And so that's really where we started with our focus. And we've done that now for 9 years. In 2021, we added programming to focus on superintendents. And one thing I think that's really important to say is I get really worried actually that sometimes we think that the most important people in our schools and districts are the furthest from kids. The most important people in our schools and districts are the closest to kids, but the people in these roles, principals and superintendents, make so many decisions that set the conditions. And so in 2021, we added a focus on superintendents. And then over the last few years, what we've noticed are two things. One, the teaching profession across the country, but especially in Texas, is under enormous strain. There's a lot of discussion about the teacher crisis, and I think it's important to say that's caught our attention, since COVID, but it's really not new. So if you go back, as you probably know, to 2009, we really saw a decline of interest in teaching degrees amongst young people. And then, across the country and in Texas, we saw a big spike in teachers leaving the profession in 2021, 22, and 23. And when you see that big spike in people leaving and a declining interest in entering the profession, it produces a pretty big challenge, which is, in Texas, there's a lot of districts that have had a hard time staffing every classroom. And in general, the profession in Texas is skewing significantly towards brand new teachers, and brand new teachers who often had pretty limited training and preparation before they entered the classroom. And we all are familiar with the research that says teaching is a really hard profession and you're getting good at it over your first 5 years. So you're not at your best in years 1, 2, or 3. And so we're seeing, kind of warning lights go off. Student learning is not as strong in those classrooms with brand new teachers with limited preparation. And so that's kind of the challenge with teaching. And I think we tend to kind of talk about teaching over here, and then we talk about principals over here. We talk about assistant principals somewhere else. But I actually think the challenges we see with teachers are linked to challenges that we're seeing with principals. And you're also seeing an uptick in turnover and shorter tenures, shorter careers amongst principals. There's a lot of research that they too are experiencing their jobs as increasingly stressful, far more stressful than like the average American worker. And many principals forecast that they just cannot kind of stay in the job. And I believe part of that is if you look at all that we've piled on the plate of a principal over the last 25 years, we've just added more and more and more, and we haven't taken anything off. And there's some research that was done about 10 years ago that looks at principals and how they understand their responsibility as an instructional leader, which there's been a lot of discussion about the way instructional leadership expectations have ramped up in the last 20 years. And it found that about 82% of principals view themselves as the primary person responsible for the development of all of the teachers in their building. And to connect the dots here, I mean, in Texas, you have a lot of big schools. And so you might have a principal in one AP, you have 20, 30, 40 or more teachers. And with what's happening with the teaching profession, there are going to be schools in Texas where up to 50% of those 20, 30, 40 teachers are brand new. And many of them receive very limited training and preparation. And if you think that you are one principal who's going to be able to provide the level of support and coaching that all those teachers need to become great and stay in the profession, that is a mind-boggling proposition. And we know that it's not the only thing that principals do. And so I think it's not surprising that we have principals who say, I'm stretched way too thin and entirely overloaded and simply cannot get to all of the responsibilities that are important for my school to succeed and teachers to feel supported. And it's not surprising that teachers are saying, I feel like I'm on an island, and I don't have the resources or support that I need to succeed in this role. And it's not surprising that both are saying, I'm not sure if I can make it, very long in this profession. So the book basically makes an argument that like the model of leadership that we've been using for the last 20 years is just outdated, and it doesn't provide enough capacity for schools to accomplish all of the tasks that they need to accomplish to serve students well. And it argues that we need to ask principals to let go of some leadership, and it proposes a 4-level leadership model that would empower and elevate teachers with real formal leadership, time to do it, pay for that, a rethinking of assistant principals and how they operate, and a team-based approach to school leadership. So that's the new book, and why I think it's so important right now. I did do my doctoral work on unions and studied the way that unions respond to and shape policy. And I was looking at performance-related pay and the way unions and across different contexts navigated those issues. So happy to talk more about unions and how they may show up and thinking about like what it looks like to lead and support teachers differently as well.
So you went into a lot there around something that I'm seeing also in Colorado, and I'm sure a lot of places with we don't have enough trained teachers to fill
Yeah,
the positions. Some districts or schools might get the FTE to hire instructional coaches, but what I'm seeing a lot is that these instructional coaches are also teaching part-time. So they might only be over like math or science.
hmm
And then like you said, even if a teacher is in a math or English department, they do feel siloed, especially if they might not get along with colleagues, or there isn't like a job embedded PD, or the PLCs aren't as effective. So what would you suggest in terms of like uh really moving forward, because you're talking about this model for instructional leadership that's 20 years old,
yeah,
and we haven't really like like you said, the principal's plates are being overloaded,
yeah,
uh, and they're often looked to be the instructional leader. What would be a better solution in these
yeah.
groups?
Well, and I'll pick up on a few of the things that you mentioned, and so I mean the book basically argues for taking all of the personnel that we have and really trying to reevaluate if we're using them in the most effective and coherent way. And I'll pick up on instructional coaches, and you may be seeing something a little bit different or have a little bit of a different point of view. But one thing that I think is pretty interesting, if you look at like IAS data from the last like 15 years or so, and you look at the basically the growth in the student population across the country, and then you compare that to the teaching population, which the way they measure the teaching population picks up a lot of other instructional positions that are basically not classroom teachers and not assistant principals. So it'll pick up instructional coaches, instructional specialists, roles like that. What you basically see is, the student population, as we know, is starting to plateau and decline, across the country, but was increasing modestly, over the last 10 to 12 years. But the number of teachers that we're employing across the country has been growing at a much faster rate than the number of students that we have in our schools. And there's probably a couple of different drivers of that. One can be specialized high school courses, which tend to require additional positions that may not educate as many students because they need to really meet that specific need. Another can be inefficiencies is the wrong word, but as we have some districts that are smaller or more rural, you're going to see some variance related to that. But the other factor that most people point to that's driving that is we've created a lot of instructional coach and instructional specialist positions. And I actually think it's one good place to start is, are we utilizing those folks for maximum value and maximum impact in terms of the support they provide teachers? And I'm not, for what it's worth, I'm not convinced that a 50-50 model is necessarily bad. Because I think there actually can be a lot of benefits to having the person who's coaching and supporting other teachers still have a foot in a classroom. One, because if they're really good at it, we want them with kids. And two, I think it really helps with credibility, and it helps that person to stay fresh and to stay current with what it's like to teach 2-day with this curriculum, with the systems that we're using. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the 50-50 model. I think the key is you have to make sure that it's apportioned correctly, and that the 50% of time that you have to lead is adequate for the leadership responsibilities you're given, and that we stay disciplined, about using that time and we don't fill it with a bunch of other things. But the other part that I think is really important in that research I mentioned earlier about principals and the percentage who view themselves as primarily responsible. They also studied folks in these like teacher leadership positions, specialist coaches, facilitators, and they found that only 22% of those people viewed themselves as responsible for for the development of the people that they supported. And I actually think that's a pretty big problem. Because I think if we are creating a lot of coach and specialist positions, but we just kind of view them as like optional, nice supports that are roaming around the school, I don't think that is a structured enough approach to teacher support and feedback to get the results that we need. And so, like one push in the book is to say, how do you take those talented team members that you have, but put more definition around their leadership responsibilities and give them more responsibility and authority to be the primary support for teachers, and maybe it is just in their content area or in their grade level. So that's one part of it. But then the other thing I'll speak to is, and probably maybe what you're pointing out is like if you just have like a grade level over here, it can get really incoherent. And people can be doing a lot of things in isolation that doesn't add up to the success of the school. And so in the leadership model that I propose in the book, there's four levels. There's team member, which is where a lot of your classroom teachers are going to be. There's school leader, which should be the principal. And then there's what's called team leaders, which is where I think a lot of these teacher leaders with formal time, money, and responsibility for leadership. But then there's a layer in between that, which I call the bridge leader. And I would think of that as like some schools have a dean of instruction, and you could think of it like an assistant principal, but an assistant principal who's actually focused almost exclusively on leading the instructional program in the school. And so ideally that bridge leader, even if you maybe have these part-time team leaders that may have different grade levels or content areas, the bridge leader is helping them to work together and to build a more coherent professional learning program across the school. So that's like a sketch of how the framework works. But the other thing I would say is I don't believe there's like one organizational chart that you can plop down on a school. There is just way too much variation and diversity in the 14,000 or maybe 13,500 public schools that exist across the US. So I think of this more as like principles and a framework that a school leader could use to say, what's the best way for us to achieve these outcomes, these leadership outcomes, in our school context with the people that we have?
Yeah, I really like how you propose that. I think, like you said, there are people who aren't necessarily being used to their full capacity, or there could be a lot of vagueness around certain roles that people have, especially if they are doing part-time teaching. And or there could just be too many teachers on their caseload and
Yeah.
like really intentionally setting that rotation list
Yeah.
for their teachers. But yeah, it's like you said, it's been a while since I've been in a school where they actually had assistant principals who were in charge of curriculum and instruction, or
Yeah.
one was in charge of discipline and attendance, right? Now it's just kind of everybody's taking a little bit of whatever, and
Yeah.
it's not really clearly delineated. So, like, it goes back about 12 to 15 years where I think it was more delineated. And
Yeah.
now everybody's just, I think, trying to catch up with the demands of test scores going up and those types of
Mhm.
things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, talk to me a little bit about your current role, what you do at the Holdsworth Center in terms of just partnerships. You work with a lot of school districts in Texas, like you said. What got you into that role and
Mhm.
just interest in working in advocacy?
Yeah. So the one thing I will say, the one thing we don't do is advocacy. So we focus. There's actually another organization that the person who founded our organization has created in Texas called Raise Your Hand Texas, that focuses on policy change. I think we've been tasked with staying out of policy. And the way I think of it is there are a lot of conditions in policy that are important for how we can drive student learning. And in any policy condition, there are always things that superintendents, principals, and teachers can do to get better student results. And frankly, I think leaders have to have a good muscle for being clear about like where am I trying to influence and change policy, but then how do I not let all of my attention go there? Because if I do, I'm missing the opportunity that I have to influence the things that I can control and change, within my school, within my district. So we really focus on supporting leaders, at the district and the campus level to do all that they can within whatever the policy environment is to serve students well. And we do that through a variety of leadership development programs. They're pretty long and pretty intensive. So the people who go through our programs joke that they should get a master's degree. We don't award any degrees, but they say it's as rigorous and as intensive as their master's program. You can think of it in structure like an executive master's. So over 12 to 18 to 24 months, folks come to a campus that we run, that we operate in Austin for 2 or 3 days, either as an individual or with their team for learning. But everybody we work with is in a job, is already in a leadership role, whether as a teacher, principal, or superintendent. And so they can take everything they learn and immediately go back and put it into practice. In our programs, we've worked with over 2,000 leaders in Texas across about 100 school districts, which there's 1,200 in Texas. So 100 is a lot, but still a pretty small percentage. There's a lot more to do. But we kind of have three big lanes of work, a series of programs focused on principals and aspiring principals, a series of programs focused on sitting and aspiring superintendents. And then we have some new programming that will launch this summer that's related to the book. We'll be working with 6 districts who are going to reinvent school leadership in about half their campuses and not just change the structure, but help the people who are in those leadership positions build the skills that they need to lead well. In a new model. So we're really excited about that. But I got to this work because I was supposed to be a teacher, and then I had an opportunity to go to graduate school and studied international education and ended up focusing on education politics and the role of unions. And because I was doing international work, I had the opportunity, early in my career to not just look at the US, but look at other systems around the world who get the kind of results that we claim we want to have, really high achievement, low variation between your highest and lowest performing students, and low predictability on who's going to be highest and lowest performing, a lower relationship between how much education your mom has or how much money your dad makes or what language you speak at home or what race you and your family are. Like if you look at those systems, those people who get those results, high performing, low variation, low predictability, they have a couple of things in common. And a lot of people get really worked up about international comparison and how we can't just pick up something that somebody does someplace else and pop it down. That's true. But we can notice the patterns in what works in other places, and we can notice whether it matches the strategies that we're pursuing here. And one of the patterns that I would point out is there isn't a high-performing nation or educational system that I can point to that hasn't placed a really big emphasis over a long period of time on attracting people to the teaching profession and providing them with the training and development that they need to become good teachers. There's not a single place that I can point to that gets good results that hasn't done that. And I think we've attempted many things to improve schools in the US, since the early 1980s. But partly because of our size and because of our structure, we're big and we're decentralized. It's pretty hard to put together like a nationwide strategy to develop an excellent teaching profession. And so I would argue that that is something we have never successfully done. And so when I came back to the US and was looking to get back into education, I couldn't get a job as a teacher right away. And so I landed a couple different places. And then I met Charles Butt, who's the chairman of HEB, and I learned about his vision for Holdsworth, which fundamentally is a place that exists to do one thing, which is to invest in educators. And at first, I didn't know I wanted to live in Texas. And so I offered to help him remotely kind of build the strategy for this thing. And then he helped convince me that I did want to live in Texas. But it really was about recognizing that he had this vision for a place that was about investing in people. And I had become convinced that the big thing that was missing from our efforts to improve education across this country was like a real serious effort to invest in people.
Yeah, so that goes in a lot to kind of your studies abroad and how, like, we're always talking still about, especially Finland and their model. And when you were over the seas what were some of the models that you maybe took more into account, and how maybe some of the ideas could
Yeah.
be brought to the US?
Yeah. So I lived in Finland for a year, which I have to lead with that because it produces a lot of strong reactions. But through my career, so both my academic work and then subsequently, I've had the opportunity to visit and study a pretty wide range of educational systems. So I have like been on the ground in Finland and Sweden, Germany, the UK. Um, have spent time in some of the high performing Asian systems, so Japan, Shanghai, Singapore, um, and then also have spent some time in Canada, which is a system closer to home. It's not quite as big, but has a lot in common with the US, and I think we may not pay quite enough attention to our neighbor in terms of some things that they really get right around education. Um, but really for me, the big headline is the one I already made, which is the focus on people. I mean, there are other things that are true in terms of like most systems have a strong unified curriculum. In smaller systems, it's just a lot easier than it is in the US. Um, to basically to unify and harmonize how teachers are prepared. So like Finland, part of why people are so unwilling to consider things from Finland is because it is pretty hard to translate. In Finland, it's a much smaller place, and so you have between 9 and 13 places that educate teachers, which there's probably that many universities that educate teachers in Houston. And so there are just some challenges of scale for us. But I do think those principles can remind us about some foundational things that are important to how we improve schools. The other thing that I would lift up, but I think this is a side effect of building a strong education profession, high performing systems, I believe as a pattern, tend to have a virtuous cycle of trust where because the education profession is strong, policymakers and people at different levels tend to operate with a greater level of deference and trust in the skill and decision making of educators. And so there tends to be like a stronger spirit of partnership where everyone views their job as working in support, with the other parties to improve schools. Whereas I think it's easy to fall into a pattern of distrust where, policymakers or state or district leaders are operating with distrust towards teachers, and teachers may operate with distrust towards policymakers and state and district leaders. And I do think that's another kind of characteristic. And I think the question for us is how do we move towards a virtuous cycle where we're using data to say, how do we need to work together to support each other to get the results that we want for kids? And I think that's the kind of narrative and thinking that we need to build.
Yeah, there was a lot there around just kind of what you've experienced in those other countries, but like you said, that cycle of trust, I really think that's also a big one, right? And I think as we move through like just the time I've been in education in the last 26 years, right? I think, the past 5 and then 10 and then 15, like there has been more trust in the system. And, I think like you said, the people who are least in the schools, least working with the schools, there is that disconnect between the district office, the superintendent, what they want for the schools, yet they're not the ones who are working with students or experiencing the challenges that those people who are working with the students are. And so I think, yeah, like you said, it's really trying to centralize also, but like when you have both public, private
Yeah,
charters and all that, it's hard to kind of come to a common agreement, and we can learn all about these systems or take ideas at conferences, but like you said, it's for the public ed,
yeah,
it's a different story. And I think if a district has a vision of going a certain way, and building a culture of trust, and retaining their teachers, that would be that
yeah,
specific district's idea.
yeah. One thing that's interesting to me, I think, probably given my perspective and vantage
Hmm.
point, I'm getting ready to teach a class at a university next week, and there will be future teachers in the class, and there will be kind of aspiring principals. And they sent some questions, and it reminds me of something that I've noticed more broadly, which is there's a tendency for all of us um, to point somewhere else at who is the problem.
Yeah.
Um, and it's always interesting to me because we work with educators at every single level of the system, from the classroom to the superintendent. And generally speaking, across the board, like the vast majority, like 99, 98, 99% of the people that we work with are extraordinary people who care about kids and are trying to do the right thing. And the way that people can misunderstand and misread each other across roles is really profound
Mhm.
to me. Because sometimes I'll know the superintendent, the principal, and the teacher, who's involved in
Mhm.
this. And I'll think you all want the same thing, for kids, but our potential to misunderstand and distrust each other is really high. So I think the provocative challenge that I do want to start giving is I think we all think that somebody else has to start the trust virtuous cycle, you
Mhm.
know? And I think we all have more potential than we think we do to start that. Like where might we actually extend a spirit of trust and extend a spirit of curiosity, and start by assuming best intention to see if there actually is more shared space to work together for kids. Because I think we're all in a little bit of a cycle of
Mhm.
defaulting towards assuming
Mhm.
that other people may not have like our or kids' best interests at heart. So I think we all have to be looking for places where we can start kind of moving that trust in a different direction.
Would that maybe start with more committee work that invites employees from all employee groups in a district to work with district leaders?
It could, and I mean, I think, I mean, this will get a little bit back into the book. Committees are one form.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think there's a district that I highlight in the book that I think as they've reworked their school leadership architecture, what they've really just thought about is like, how do we get clearer about how we share responsibility to make decisions, And so rather than, because I think what a committee evokes for me is it assumes that all the decisions are going to get made at a certain place. Like all the decisions are going to be made by the superintendent or all the decisions are going to be made by the principal. And then what we need are committees for other people to get to have input to those decisions. And so that's one model. But another model is to say maybe there's some decisions that the superintendent's currently making or the district's currently making that could just get made by teachers. Or could just get made, by someone else. And maybe those decision makers could just have a more ongoing practice of listening to what people are saying and seeking input and perspectives um, in a more pervasive way that could reduce the need for like committees. The challenge is obviously committees is a visible way to show that you're seeking feedback and input. So I think that's always something, for people to keep in mind. But I think I would hope for there also to be like more organic and embedded ways of including people in shaping the vision and decisions that are being made.
Yeah, no, I think there are a lot of ideas there that I think leaders can take into account as they start the new school year and getting more voice, right? And the people that are working with the students, like you said, a lot of decisions can be made in departments or by teacher leaders, but we have a lot of things that you mentioned to think about in terms of that structure as well with the leadership, right? That not everybody's at the top, like if we can have these middle managers, right? The teachers, the teacher leaders, the bridge leaders, etc. We've had a great conversation today around your book, your work, and also just some of the research that you've done. Out of everything we've talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
I think I would want to lift up two things, which is no matter what position you're in a school, to not lose sight of the fact that the center of the work is the work that happens in our classrooms
Hmm.
between teachers and students. And every other person exists to support. that work. And I think that has to be more of our shared mindset
Mhm.
of how we do this. We're all in service to teachers and students, and then I think the second would be, and we can all be people who can move us in a direction of greater trust, and to look for small opportunities to practice that. Because I think we are generally folks who are working in public education generally are all trying to get it right for kids, and if we can see that we have that. Shared motivation. I think, and we can give credit for that. I think we can work together more constructively than if we approach each other with suspicion or skepticism.
Mhm. Where can people connect with you and find you online?
So generally, if you look up the Holdsworth Center, we're on most of the platforms where people get and share information. I am a reluctant social media user, and so you can find me on LinkedIn, but not really anywhere else. It's the compromise I've made with our technology, but
Mm.
generally following the Holdsworth Center is going to be the best place. And then if you look up a new school leadership architecture, you can buy that through the publisher, Corwin, or you can find it on Amazon and other platforms.
Okay, I'll include those links in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being my guest on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure talking education with you and just hearing more about your book.
Thanks so much.